in my own parliament, we carried out some work last year analysing parliamentary debates over the last decade to see, has there been a change since COVID in terms of the use of scientific evidence in Parliament. The suspicion would be because there's more scientists making contact with us, because science is being spoken about more in the media, that would then be reflected in Parliament. The analysis has shown us that there hasn't been a change in terms of the use of science in Parliament pre and post COVID. However, what it has shown us is that there has been a worrying indication that there's a reduction in the responsiveness of members of Parliament to engagement from the scientific community. So they're getting a bit sick and tired of the scientific community coming with the usual begging bowl, asking for money, which is usually the first question that they ask for. So this is very concerning in a post-truth society. It's very concerning for democratic debate. And while this was only conducted in the Irish Parliament, anecdotally I'm hearing the same story from members of Parliament in other parts of the world as well. But on a more positive aspect, within our working group, we have been collating case studies of parliamentary engagement with the scientific community, and we've had some very significant feedback in relation to that. So we've been collating this data. We have 12 case studies from right across the globe, north and south, and we've been collating this to develop a toolkit for members of Parliament so that they can reach out and engage with the parliamentary or with the scientific community. And now this is feedback coming from engaged MPs in the first place who are reaching out to do that engagement. But what it has shown is, in a nutshell, it's typified by a comment by one member of Parliament, and that was that the engagement was extremely effective. It provided a strong evidence base which MPs accepted. In the main, MPs set aside their preconceptions of what worked and were committed to learning from established international best practice. And other MPs were making the point that it was easier to get it accepted in Parliament because there was a whole of society approach to it by having the empirical evidence feed into the process. So it provided credibility and, more importantly, broad acceptance of those proposals. So we asked those members of Parliament what actually worked. And what they said to us was the most successful engagements were the ones where input was sought at the beginning of the parliamentary process and remained engaged throughout the process. So a bit like the evidence we're hearing from, African parliaments, it's actually happening worldwide where the scientists are involved in an iterative process rather than just presenting the evidence at the door of parliamentarians. The other thing they said was that where the evidence focused on the challenges relevant to MPs, without going too detailed into the technical jargon, it was most useful to them. They also said that when discussions took place in a public forum, that partisan politics came out during that, but where it was held in private under Chatham House rules, that most of the MPs left the politics outside the door and engaged in a more free manner with the scientists. The big challenge that they found was timing, because members of Parliament are time poor. How do you get an engagement process that gets all of the MPs that you want involved? And their suggestion was that you run it at different times on different days over a series and not just a one-off. So that brings up two other issues then that came up from the members of Parliament. The first one is there's a big issue in relation to open data. Scientific research, they're saying, should be freely and easily accessible in an understandable format for members of the public. And the preliminary evidence we're getting from the case studies is that where research is presented and has clarity in terms of its length, its ease of understanding, it's a key factor in actually the members of Parliament picking it up and actually using that particular evidence. The other thing that we found really successful in Ireland, and actually it's one of the recommendations of our working group now in terms of our ethical charter, and that is the introduction of what's called pre-legislative scrutiny. So before the actual legislation is published, legally now the government must present to the relevant parliamentary committee a draft of the legislation, and allows the members of parliament to seek public submissions. And we're getting the academics now coming into us, reluctantly, and we're dragging them in, but coming into us and feeding into that process. We're then making recommendations that are actually getting into legislation. So I think if you look at parliaments where they have a pre-legislative scrutiny element before the final legislation is drafted, then it's having a bigger impact. And the reason for that is very simple. Legislation takes a long time to draft. And the civil servants that are drafting that, this is their baby. You cannot go and tell a civil servant that he's made a flawed piece of legislation. So it's much easier to get them before they've done the final drafting on it. And we have found actually that legislation is now going through Parliament far quicker, with less amendments, because more of the contentious issues are taken out of it at an earlier stage.